My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 32 years old, I never imagined that my own family would attempt to steal what was rightfully mine. The lakeside cabin my great-aunt Rebecca left me was more than just property. It was my refuge, my creative sanctuary, and the only place where I could truly breathe. When I discovered my parents secretly planning to sell it behind my back to fund my brother's failing business, something fundamental shifted inside me. That moment would forever change the dynamics of our family, and I'm about to tell you exactly how it all unfolded. But before I dive into this incredible journey of betrayal, boundaries, and ultimately finding my voice, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from around the world. If you enjoy stories about standing up for yourself when family crosses the line, hit that like button and subscribe for daily inspiring stories that will empower you to set your own boundaries. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, my great-aunt Rebecca was like a second mother to me. While my parents were constantly focused on my older brother Marcus and his endless schemes and ventures, Aunt Rebecca saw something special in me. Every summer from the time I was 10 until I graduated high school, I would spend entire months at her rustic lakeside cabin in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours outside the city. Those summers were magical. Aunt Rebecca taught me how to paint watercolors on the wraparound deck overlooking Mirror Lake, how to identify different bird species that visited her feeders, and how to tend the wildflower garden that attracted butterflies from across the valley. During long evenings, we would sit by the stone fireplace as she shared stories about her adventures as a travel photographer in the 1970s and 80s, showing me albums filled with pictures from remote corners of the world. "Sarah," she would say in her gentle but firm voice, her weathered hands guiding mine as I learned to mix colors on my palette, "never let anyone diminish your dreams or take advantage of your generous heart. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who will try to limit us the most." At the time, I thought she was speaking generally about following your passions. I had no idea how prophetic those words would become. The cabin itself was a stunning A-frame structure built in the 1960s, with floor-to-ceiling windows that captured the lake's reflection and the surrounding pine forest. It featured 2 bedrooms, an open-concept living area with a loft, and a screened-in porch that became my favorite reading spot. The property included a private dock, a small guest house that Aunt Rebecca had converted into her photography studio, and nearly an acre of landscaped grounds that attracted deer and other wildlife. When Aunt Rebecca passed away 4 years ago at 86, I was heartbroken. Her death wasn't unexpected. She'd been battling lung cancer for over a year, but losing her felt like losing a part of my soul. During the reading of her will, I was surprised and deeply moved to learn she had left the lakeside cabin specifically to me, along with a heartfelt letter that brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest Sarah," the letter read in her elegant handwriting, "I am leaving this special place to you because you understand its magic in ways the others never could. I have watched you find peace and inspiration here since you were a child. This cabin holds decades of memories and creative energy, and I know you will honor that legacy while creating your own beautiful chapters. This isn't just real estate, darling. It's a piece of your artistic soul." Initially, my family seemed supportive of the inheritance. My parents owned a comfortable suburban home in Lake Oswego and had never shown particular interest in what they called Rebecca's isolated mountain retreat. My brother Marcus, 35 and perpetually chasing the next big business opportunity, was too busy with his latest startup venture to care about what he dismissed as an old cabin in the middle of nowhere. Over the past 4 years, I had poured my heart and a significant portion of my savings as a freelance graphic designer into maintaining and improving the property. I updated the plumbing and electrical systems, restored the original hardwood floors, winterized the guest house for year-round use, and recreated Aunt Rebecca's wildflower garden using seeds I'd carefully saved from her original plantings. Every weekend I could manage, I would make the 2-hour drive from Portland, arriving Friday evening and reluctantly returning Sunday night, my creative spirit recharged by the tranquility I found there. The contrast between Marcus and me had always been stark. While I had built a steady freelance career designing websites and marketing materials for local businesses, slowly building a reputation for reliability and creativity, Marcus bounced from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. Tech startups, cryptocurrency ventures, dropshipping businesses. Our parents constantly made excuses for his entrepreneurial spirit and innovative thinking, while my practical approach to building a sustainable career was simply expected rather than celebrated. "Your brother is a visionary," my mother would say whenever Marcus's latest venture inevitably collapsed, leaving him in debt and looking for family support. "He just needs the right opportunity to showcase his talents." Meanwhile, my consistent income and professional growth were acknowledged with brief nods before conversations quickly shifted back to whatever drama Marcus had created this week. Despite this lifelong imbalance, I maintained a cordial relationship with my family. Monthly dinners at my parents' house in their upscale neighborhood were a tradition, though I often felt more like an observer than a participant, as conversations centered around Marcus's latest business idea or my parents' social commitments. I had learned to smile and nod, keeping my own achievements and challenges to myself to avoid seeming like I was competing for attention. Everything began to change 3 months ago when Marcus announced that his latest venture, an app designed to connect dog owners with local pet services, was failing spectacularly. Unlike his previous failures, this one had legal implications. He had borrowed money from investors, made promises he couldn't keep, and now faced potential lawsuits that could result in personal bankruptcy. As I sat at my parents' dining room table listening to Marcus explain his predicament, I could see the familiar pattern emerging. The expectation that family would rally around him, that somehow we would all sacrifice to solve his problems, while he learned nothing from the experience. What I couldn't anticipate was just how far that expectation would extend, or how my beloved lakeside sanctuary would become the proposed solution to Marcus's self-created crisis. The monthly family dinner where everything unraveled happened on a crisp October evening. I had driven over to my parents' Lake Oswego home directly from a client meeting, still wearing my professional blazer and carrying my laptop bag. The familiar warmth of their modern kitchen, with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, usually felt welcoming. That night, it would become the setting for a conversation that would shatter my trust in my family forever. Marcus had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at Mom's famous herb-crusted salmon, while Dad dominated the conversation with stories from his recent golf tournament. The legal troubles surrounding his failed app venture hung over the table like a storm cloud, though no one addressed them directly. This was typical for our family. We danced around problems rather than confronting them head-on. "I think I'll make some coffee," Mom announced as she began clearing the dinner plates. "Sarah, would you mind helping me with dessert?" I followed her into the kitchen, grateful for something to do with my hands. As we worked side by side, preparing her signature apple crisp and brewing coffee, the comfortable routine felt normal, familiar. I had no idea that Marcus and Dad were having the conversation that would change everything. When we returned to the dining room with the dessert service, I noticed an odd tension in the air. Marcus was staring at his hands, while Dad wore the expression he got when he was working up to making an important announcement. Neither seemed interested in the warm apple crisp that usually sparked enthusiastic compliments. "Sarah," Dad began, clearing his throat in that formal way he used for serious conversations, "we need to discuss something important with you, about Rebecca's cabin." I felt my stomach tighten. In 4 years, my parents had barely mentioned the property, except to occasionally ask how my weekend getaways were going. "What about it?" I asked carefully, setting down my coffee cup. Mom shot Dad a meaningful look that I caught but couldn't interpret. "Well," Dad continued, We've been thinking about Marcus's situation, and we believe we found a solution that could help everyone involved. The word everyone immediately put me on alert. In my experience, family solutions that supposedly helped everyone usually meant I was expected to sacrifice something for Marcus's benefit. Go on, I prompted, though a chill was already settling in my chest. The thing is, Marcus finally spoke up, his voice lacking its usual confidence. My legal troubles are worse than I initially let on. The investors aren't just threatening to sue, they're demanding immediate repayment of their initial investments plus damages. We're talking about nearly $200,000, Sarah. I absorbed this number with growing dread. That's a lot of money, Marcus. But what does this have to do with my cabin? Even as I asked the question, I was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading, and the realization made me feel slightly nauseous. Dad leaned forward in his chair, assuming his businessman persona. Rebecca's property has appreciated significantly since she bought it in the 60s. I had a real estate friend do an informal assessment, and we're looking at a value of around $400,000, possibly more in today's market. Which means, Mom added, her voice taking on that overly sweet tone she used when trying to convince someone of something, if we sold it, there would be enough to pay off Marcus's debts and still have money left over for everyone to benefit from. I stared at them, waiting for someone to acknowledge what they were actually suggesting. When no one did, I found my voice. You want me to sell my cabin to pay for Marcus's mistakes? It wasn't a question. Now, Sarah, Dad said quickly, don't think of it like that. This is about family, supporting family during a crisis. Marcus could face bankruptcy, possibly even criminal charges, if this isn't resolved quickly. The cabin just sits empty most of the week anyway. It doesn't just sit empty, I replied, my voice sharper than intended. It's my home away from home. It's where I do my best creative work. It's where I feel closest to Aunt Rebecca's memory. And it belongs to me, legally and morally. Marcus finally looked up from his hands, and I was shocked to see, not shame or apology in his eyes, but a kind of desperate entitlement. Sarah, I'm facing prison time. Actual prison. Don't you think a building is less important than your brother's freedom? The manipulation in his words hit me like a physical blow. A building? I repeated. Marcus, that building is the most meaningful place in my life. Aunt Rebecca left it to me specifically because she knew I would cherish and protect it. She chose me, not the family as a whole. But surely she would have wanted it to be used to help family in crisis, Mom interjected. Rebecca always talked about the importance of family loyalty. I felt anger rising in my chest at this revisionist interpretation of my great-aunt's values. Family loyalty? I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. What about loyalty to me? What about respecting Aunt Rebecca's wishes? What about acknowledging that this is my property to decide about, not a family asset to be distributed as you see fit? The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's jaw was tight with frustration, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. Mom looked genuinely confused, as if my attachment to the cabin was an inexplicable quirk rather than a reasonable emotional connection. Marcus appeared to be calculating, probably wondering if different tactics might be more effective. We're not trying to take anything from you, Dad said finally. You'd get your share of the proceeds, of course, probably around $100,000 after Marcus's debts are settled and expenses are paid. That's more money than you've ever had at once. And where exactly would I go for inspiration, for peace, for connection to the aunt who meant everything to me? My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Do you really think money can replace what that place means to me? You could buy something smaller, Mom suggested hopefully. Maybe a nice condo with a view. Something easier to maintain and closer to the city. The casual way she dismissed the spiritual and emotional significance of the cabin to me was breathtaking in its insensitivity. "I already have an apartment in the city," I replied. "The cabin isn't about convenience, Mom. It's about connection, creativity, and honoring the legacy of someone who believed in me when no one else seemed to notice I existed." The last part slipped out before I could stop it, revealing more about my lifelong feelings of being overshadowed than I had ever intended. The truth hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Marcus seized on my emotional revelation. "That's not fair, Sarah. We've always supported your career, your choices. But this is different. This is about survival, about keeping me out of prison. Surely your art projects can wait until we resolve this crisis." His dismissal of my creative life as mere art projects was the final straw. Everything I had accomplished, every client I had served, every beautiful design I had created in the peaceful inspiration of that lakeside sanctuary, all reduced to trivial hobbies that could be put on hold for his convenience. "No," I said simply, grabbing my purse from the counter. "The answer is no. I will not sell my cabin to fix your problems, Marcus. Find another solution." "Sarah, sit back down," Dad commanded in his authoritative voice. "We're not finished discussing this." But I was finished. More finished than I had ever been with anything in my life. "Yes, we are finished," I replied, walking toward the front door. "The cabin is mine. Aunt Rebecca left it to me. I've maintained it, improved it, and loved it for 4 years. It is not for sale, not now, not ever." As I reached for the door handle, Mom called after me desperately. "Think about it, honey. Just think about what's really important here. Family has to come first." I paused with my hand on the door, turning back to look at the 3 people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally. "You're right, Mom. Family does come first. That's exactly what I'm doing. Honoring the family member who actually valued me enough to trust me with her most precious possession." The drive home through Portland's evening traffic gave me time to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through my system. For 32 years, I had been the accommodating daughter, the one who didn't cause trouble, who went along with family decisions for the sake of harmony. Tonight, that version of myself had finally reached her breaking point. As I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, one thought crystallized in my mind. This was just the beginning. My family clearly believed that eventually I would cave to their pressure, as I always had before. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The aftermath of that dinner began immediately. Before I had even reached my apartment, my phone was buzzing with texts from my mother. "Sarah, please don't be stubborn about this. Marcus really needs our help." By the time I unlocked my front door, there were 3 voicemails from Dad, each one progressively more stern and demanding that I, quote, "think rationally about the family situation." I turned off my phone and poured myself a large glass of wine, sitting on my small balcony overlooking the city lights. The contrast between my cramped urban apartment and the expansive peace of the lakeside cabin had never felt more pronounced. Just thinking about losing that sanctuary made my chest tight with anxiety. The next morning brought a fresh wave of family pressure. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. Mom had clearly been awake most of the night, crafting increasingly emotional appeals. "Your brother is scared, Sarah. Really scared. We're a family. We stick together through tough times." Dad's messages were more direct. "This selfishness isn't like you. Call me back so we can discuss this, like adults." But it was Marcus's messages that truly revealed the depths of his entitlement. "I can't believe you're choosing a vacation house over your own brother's freedom. What would Aunt Rebecca think about you abandoning family?" The manipulation was breathtaking, attempting to use my beloved great-aunt's memory against me. I called in sick to work that day, unable to focus on client projects while processing the emotional whiplash of my family's behavior. Instead, I drove straight to the cabin, needing the comfort and clarity that only Mirror Lake could provide. The 2-hour drive through the Columbia River Gorge usually filled me with anticipation, but today it felt like fleeing. As I wound through the mountain roads, past the familiar landmarks that marked my journey to peace, I tried to understand how we had reached this point. When had my family started viewing my inheritance as their backup plan? When had my needs and feelings become so irrelevant to them? Arriving at the cabin, I sat on the dock with my feet in the cold lake water, watching the morning mist rise from the surface. This was where Aunt Rebecca had taught me to meditate, where she'd shared her philosophy about life and creativity. "Never apologize for taking up space in this world, Sarah," she had told me during one of our sunrise conversations. "Your dreams and needs are just as valid as anyone else's." My phone rang, interrupting my meditation. It was my mother, and against my better judgment I answered. "Thank goodness," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I was so worried when you didn't return our calls." "Are you at that cabin?" "Sarah, we need to talk about this situation properly." "There's nothing to talk about, Mom," I replied, watching a family of ducks paddle past the dock. My answer hasn't changed overnight. "But you haven't heard all the details," she pressed. "Marcus's lawyer says if he can pay back the investors quickly, they might drop the criminal charges. This could literally save his future, honey. His entire life." The emotional manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. "And what about my future, Mom? What about my life, my peace of mind, my creative sanctuary? When do those things matter?" There was a long pause. "Of course those things matter, Sarah. But this is temporary. You can find inspiration anywhere. Marcus only has one chance to avoid prison." Marcus had multiple chances to avoid this situation. I countered. He chose to take investors' money without a viable business plan. He chose to make promises he couldn't keep. He chose to ignore warning signs that his app was failing. These are consequences of his choices, not a family emergency that requires my sacrifice. "You're being very cold about this," Mom said, her tone shifting from pleading to accusatory. "This isn't the daughter I raised. The Sarah I know would never let her brother suffer when she had the means to help." That stung, as it was intended to. "The daughter you raised learned to put everyone else's needs before her own, because that was the only way to get attention in this family. But Aunt Rebecca taught me that I matter too, that my dreams and possessions are valid and worthy of protection." "Rebecca filled your head with a lot of independent nonsense," Mom snapped, revealing her true feelings about my great-aunt's influence. "She never understood family obligations, never had children of her own. You can't live your life by the standards of someone who chose to be alone." The attack on Aunt Rebecca's memory ignited something fierce in me. Rebecca wasn't alone. She was surrounded by people who respected and valued her. She traveled the world, created beautiful art, and left behind a legacy of kindness and wisdom. She understood that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing your identity for them. "Well, she certainly didn't understand sacrifice for family," Mom retorted. "If she did, she would have left that property to all of us, not just to one person." There it was, the truth finally emerging. They had always felt entitled to the cabin, had never truly accepted Aunt Rebecca's decision to leave it specifically to me. In their minds, it was a family asset that should be distributed according to current needs, not according to the wishes of its actual owner. "She left it to me because she knew I would honor and protect it," I said firmly. "Because she understood that not everything valuable can be measured in dollars, and not every problem can be solved by selling what others hold dear." The conversation ended with Mom hanging up in frustration. But the calls didn't stop. Throughout that weekend at the cabin, I received a steady stream of family pressure. Dad tried the guilt approach. Your brother has made mistakes, but that doesn't mean he deserves to have his life destroyed." Marcus himself called crying, begging me to, "Please don't let them send me to prison over a stupid business decision." The most disturbing call came from my cousin Jennifer, who lived in Seattle and rarely involved herself in family drama. "Sarah, your mom called me in tears," she began. "She says you're refusing to help Marcus avoid jail time. I don't understand what's going on, but surely family comes first." The realization that my parents were spreading their version of events to extended family members was like a punch to the gut. They were painting me as the selfish sister who chose property over family, conveniently omitting the fact that they had made plans for my inheritance without consulting me, that they had dismissed my emotional connection to the property, and that they expected me to sacrifice my most precious possession to clean up Marcus's mess. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "has anyone mentioned that they want me to sell the cabin Aunt Rebecca left me? The place where I've spent every weekend for 4 years, where I do my creative work, where I feel closest to her memory? They want me to sell it and give the money to Marcus to pay his business debts." There was a long pause. "Oh," she said quietly. "No, they made it sound like you were just refusing to help with money you had available. I didn't realize they wanted you to sell Rebecca's cabin. They scheduled a family meeting without telling me to decide my property's fate," I continued. "They assumed I would agree because I always have before. When I refused, they started this pressure campaign to make me feel guilty for protecting something that was left specifically to me." Jennifer's tone changed completely. "Sarah, I had no idea. That's not okay. Rebecca chose you for a reason. If she wanted the whole family to benefit from the property, she would have set it up that way in her will." After Jennifer hung up, promising to stay out of the family pressure campaign, I felt slightly vindicated, but also more isolated than ever. The weekend at the cabin, usually restorative, was marred by constant interruptions and the growing realization that my family saw me not as an individual with valid feelings and rights, but as a resource to be utilized in times of Marcus's recurring crises. Sunday evening, as I prepared to drive back to Portland, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I called a locksmith and scheduled them to change all the locks on the cabin the following day. Then I called my parents and left a voicemail. "I want to make something very clear," I said into the phone. "The lakeside cabin is not for sale. It will never be for sale. This conversation is closed. I love you all, but I will not discuss this topic anymore. Marcus will have to find another solution to his problems." As I drove down the mountain that evening, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and strength. I was mourning the loss of my family's unconditional support, but I was also standing up for myself in a way I never had before. Aunt Rebecca would have been proud. What I didn't anticipate was just how far my family would go to test my resolve. The locksmith arrived at the cabin early Monday morning as promised. Jim Morrison, a weathered man in his 60s who'd been serving the mountain communities for decades, shook his head as he examined the old hardware on the doors. "These locks haven't been changed since the 80s, I'd guess," he said, installing new deadbolts on both the main cabin and the guest house. "Smart thinking, updating the security. Lot of break-ins up here, with all these vacation properties sitting empty during the week." If only he knew, I thought grimly, that the people I was most concerned about were my own family members. After Jim left, I felt slightly more secure but also profoundly sad. Installing locks to keep out my parents and brother felt like a betrayal of everything family was supposed to mean. The week passed quietly, almost suspiciously so. My parents' daily calls had stopped, and Marcus hadn't sent any more pleading texts. I allowed myself to hope that maybe they had finally accepted my decision and were exploring other options for his legal troubles. That hope was shattered on Friday afternoon. I was in my Portland office, putting finishing touches on a website design for a local brewery, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for the Clackamas County Sheriff's Department. "Ms. Mitchell?" The voice was professional but concerned. This is Deputy Rodriguez with the Sheriff's Office. We've had reports of a break-in at a property registered to you on Mirror Lake Road. Are you able to come out and meet with us? My blood ran cold. A break-in? Is there damage to the property? I was already grabbing my keys and laptop bag, my mind racing through possibilities. Had someone actually burglarized the cabin? Or was this something else entirely? We'd rather discuss the details in person, ma'am. How soon can you get here? The 2-hour drive to the cabin felt like an eternity. I called my friend Emma, who lived in Portland and had been my emotional support through various family dramas over the years. They wouldn't try to break in, would they? I asked, though even as I said it, I could hear the doubt in my own voice. Sarah, honey, I don't know your family like you do, Emma replied carefully. But desperate people sometimes do desperate things. Just be prepared for anything when you get there. As I turned onto Mirror Lake Road, I could see 2 patrol cars parked in my driveway. My heart sank further when I recognized my father's silver Mercedes sedan parked at the road's edge, apparently having been asked to move away from the scene. Deputy Rodriguez, a middle-aged Latino man with kind but stern eyes, met me at my car. Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming out. We received a call this morning from neighbors reporting suspicious activity at your property. When we arrived, we found 3 individuals attempting to gain entry through a basement window. 3 individuals? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Your parents and brother. According to their identification, they claimed they had permission to be here, that there was a family emergency requiring access to documents inside the house. I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak wash over me. They do not have permission to be here. I changed the lock specifically to prevent unauthorized access. This property belongs to me alone. The deputy nodded sympathetically. That's what we figured from the fresh lock installations. The individuals were quite insistent that this was a family property, and they had every right to enter. Your father became particularly argumentative when we suggested they contact you directly. Looking toward where my family waited by their car, I could see Dad pacing angrily while Mom sat in the passenger seat with her head in her hands. Marcus leaned against the hood, staring at his phone with studied nonchalance, as if being caught breaking into his sister's property was just another minor inconvenience. I need to press charges, I heard myself saying, the words feeling surreal as they left my mouth. 6 months ago, I could never have imagined a scenario where I would have my own family arrested. Yet here we were. Deputy Rodriguez looked surprised. Are you certain about that, ma'am? Given that these are family members, you might want to consider. They attempted to break into my home. I interrupted, my voice stronger than I felt. The fact that we share DNA doesn't give them the right to commit crimes against me. If I don't press charges, what's to stop them from trying again? The deputy nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, ma'am. We'll need you to come to the station to file a formal complaint, but we can arrest them here for attempted breaking and entering. What followed was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I watched from my front porch as Deputy Rodriguez and his partner approached my family and informed them they were being arrested. Dad's face turned purple with rage as the handcuffs were applied. "This is ridiculous," he shouted across the yard to me. "Sarah, tell them this is a misunderstanding." "We're family!" Mom began crying as she was led to the patrol car, looking at me with such betrayal and hurt that I almost reconsidered. Almost. But then I remembered their casual dismissal of my feelings, their assumption that my property was theirs to redistribute, and their willingness to break into my home rather than respect my clearly stated boundaries. Marcus said nothing during his arrest, but the look he shot me was pure venom. In his mind, I was apparently the villain in this scenario, not the brother who had dragged his family into criminal activity to avoid the consequences of his own poor decisions. After the patrol cars left with my family in custody, I sat alone on my porch feeling emotionally devastated. The deputy had given me contact information for the prosecutor's office and explained that my family would likely be released on their own recognizance within a few hours, with court dates scheduled for the following month. My phone started ringing almost immediately. First, it was my Uncle Paul, Dad's brother, calling to yell at me for having your own parents arrested like common criminals. Then, my cousin Jennifer called back, having heard the news through the family grapevine, expressing shock and concern. "Sarah, I support your right to your property, but having them arrested? Don't you think that's a bit extreme?" "What's extreme?" I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Is 3 adults attempting to break into someone's home through a basement window because they think they're entitled to property that doesn't belong to them." The most difficult call came from Marcus's girlfriend, Ashley, whom I had always liked despite her questionable taste in men. She was crying and panicked, having just learned that her boyfriend was in jail. "Sarah, please, I know Marcus has made mistakes, but he's not a criminal," she pleaded. "He's just scared about the legal trouble with his business. Can't you drop the charges? I promise he'll never bother you about the cabin again." "Ashley, I'm sorry you're caught up in this," I said gently, "but Marcus and my parents chose to commit a crime rather than respect my decision about my own property. They had multiple opportunities to find other solutions to his debt problems. Instead, they decided to break into my home." "But they're family," she said, echoing the refrain I'd been hearing all week. "Family doesn't break into families' homes," I replied. "Family respects boundaries and decisions, even when they don't like them." That evening, as I sat by the lake watching the sunset, I received a text from Mom. "Bail hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. I hope you're satisfied with what you've done to this family." The guilt hit me like a wave. These were the people who had raised me, who had been there for school plays and graduations, who had celebrated my achievements and comforted me through heartbreaks. How had we reached a point where I was pressing criminal charges against them? But then I thought about Aunt Rebecca, about the summers we'd spent together in this very spot, about her wisdom regarding family and boundaries. She had left this cabin to me not just as property, but as a lesson in self-respect and independence. If I backed down now, if I allowed them to face no consequences for their actions, what message would that send about respecting my autonomy? I called Emma, needing to hear a supportive voice. "You did the right thing," she said firmly when I explained what had happened. "Sarah, they broke into your house. They literally attempted to commit a felony because they didn't like your answer to their demands. That's not normal family behavior, no matter how they try to spin it." "I feel like I'm destroying our family," I admitted, tears finally coming. "No, honey, you're not destroying anything. You're setting boundaries that should have been respected from the beginning. They chose to escalate this situation at every step. You just refuse to be victimized by their choices." As I prepared for bed that night in the cabin that was truly mine, protected now by new locks and the full force of the law, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was grief for the family relationships that might never recover from this. There was anger at being pushed to such an extreme measure, but there was also something I hadn't felt in years when it came to my family: respect for myself. Tomorrow would bring bail hearings, angry phone calls from relatives, and probably more guilt and manipulation. But tonight, for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt proud of the woman I was becoming. Aunt Rebecca had taught me that sometimes protecting what matters most requires courage that feels impossible in the moment, but proves to be exactly what the situation demands. The question now was whether my family would learn from this consequence, or if they would continue to escalate their attempts to claim what was never theirs to take. The bail hearing was exactly as uncomfortable as I had anticipated. I sat in the back of the Clackamas County Courthouse, watching my parents and brothers stand before Judge Martinez in their wrinkled clothes from the previous day's arrest. Mom kept glancing back at me with wounded eyes, while Dad stared straight ahead with rigid anger. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept, his usual confident demeanor replaced by genuine fear. Their court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, negotiated their release on personal recognizance with the condition that they stay away from my property. As they filed out of the courtroom, Dad finally made eye contact with me. "I hope you can live with what you've done," he said quietly as he passed my row. The disappointment in his voice cut deeper than any shouting match could have. Outside the courthouse, I was approached by a woman I didn't recognize. She was well-dressed, probably in her early 40s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "Sarah Mitchell?" "I'm Patricia Hernandez. I represent some of the investors in your brother's failed app venture." My stomach dropped. I had hoped to avoid getting pulled into the broader legal mess surrounding Marcus's business troubles. "I'm not involved in my brother's business affairs," I said carefully. "I understand that," she replied, "but I think there are some things you should know about the full scope of this situation. Would you be willing to have coffee with me? I think you might find the information enlightening." An hour later, we sat in a quiet cafe in downtown Oregon City while Patricia spread documents across our small table. What she revealed fundamentally changed my understanding of everything that had been happening. "Your brother didn't just fail to deliver a working app," she began. "He actively misrepresented the product's capabilities to secure additional funding rounds. We have emails where he claimed the app was 90% complete when our technical assessment shows he never had more than a basic prototype." She showed me bank records that made my jaw drop. Marcus received over $300,000 from investors, not the $200,000 he told your family. But here's what's really interesting. She pointed to a series of transactions. Significant amounts were transferred to accounts belonging to your parents. I stared at the papers, trying to process this information. "Are you saying my parents were involved in Marcus's business?" "More than involved. They were listed as silent partners and received regular payments disguised as consulting fees. Your father provided business planning advice, and your mother handled some of the marketing materials. They weren't innocent bystanders. They were active participants who also benefited financially." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My parents hadn't just been trying to help Marcus out of family loyalty. They had been trying to avoid their own potential legal liability. The pressure to sell my cabin wasn't about saving Marcus from the consequences of his mistakes. It was about saving themselves as well. "There's more," Patricia continued. "We've discovered that your family has been discussing the sale of your property as a solution for months, long before they ever mentioned it to you. We have records of your father contacting real estate agents about property valuations as early as January." I felt nauseous. While I had been peacefully spending weekends at my cabin, completely unaware of any family financial troubles, my parents and brother had been plotting to sell my inheritance behind my back. The family dinner where they had presented their solution hadn't been the beginning of their plan. It had been their last-ditch effort to get my cooperation after months of scheming. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Patricia's expression softened slightly. "Because you're about to be dragged into a very messy legal situation, and you deserve to know the truth about what your family has been doing. Also because we've learned that your father has been telling people you've already agreed to sell the property to help with the debts." My hands were shaking as I absorbed this final piece of information. Not only had they planned to sell my cabin without my knowledge, but Dad was apparently still telling people I had agreed to it, even after I had clearly refused, and even after they had been arrested for trying to break into my property. "What does this mean for me legally?" I asked. "Nothing. As long as you maintain your position that you never agreed to use the property as collateral or payment for their debts. But Sarah, you should know that your family's legal troubles are much more serious than they've led you to believe. We're not just talking about business debts anymore. This is fraud, potentially criminal fraud." I drove back to Portland in a daze, my entire understanding of recent events completely shattered. The family emergency that had required my sacrifice wasn't an emergency at all. It was a long-term scheme that had been unfolding for months without my knowledge. My parents weren't innocent victims trying to help their son. They were co-conspirators trying to avoid the consequences of their own questionable decisions. That evening, I received a call that I had been dreading. It was my Aunt Carol, Mom's sister, and her voice was ice cold. "Sarah, I just heard about what happened yesterday. Having your own parents arrested? I never thought I'd see the day when a child would betray their family like this." "Aunt Carol," I began, but she cut me off. "Your mother is devastated. Absolutely devastated." She called me in tears, saying she doesn't even recognize the daughter she raised. "And your poor father, having to spend a night in jail because of your selfishness." I took a deep breath, thinking of Patricia's revelations. "Did Mom tell you that she and Dad were business partners with Marcus? That they've been taking money from his investors for months? That they've been planning to sell my property since January without ever mentioning it to me?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. That can't be true," Aunt Carol finally said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "I have bank records, Carol. I have emails. They weren't trying to help Marcus out of family loyalty. They were trying to save their own skins after participating in what appears to be investor fraud." Another long pause. "Even if that's true, Sarah, they're still your parents. Family doesn't abandon family, no matter what mistakes have been made." "They abandoned me first," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "They abandoned me the moment they decided to make plans for my property without my consent. They abandoned me when they chose to break into my home rather than respect my boundaries. I didn't create this situation, Carol. I'm just refusing to be victimized by it." After that call ended, I sat in my apartment feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The family I thought I knew, imperfect but ultimately loving, had apparently never existed. In its place was a web of financial desperation, manipulation, and deception that made me question everything I had believed about my relationships with the people who were supposed to love me most. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley, Marcus's girlfriend. "Sarah, I don't know what to believe anymore. Marcus told me one story, but I'm hearing different things from other people. Can we meet? I think there are things I need to tell you too." The next morning, Ashley and I met at a small diner near her apartment in southeast Portland. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her eyes red from crying. "I didn't know," she began immediately. "About your parents being involved in Marcus's business, about them taking investor money, about any of it. Marcus told me they were just trying to help him avoid bankruptcy from a failed app." "What changed?" I asked gently. "After he got arrested, he was different. Scared in a way I'd never seen before. And he started talking about things. About backup plans your family had been discussing. About how certain he was that you'd eventually give in because you always had before." She paused, stirring her coffee absently. "Sarah, he said your parents had already picked out a real estate agent. They had listing photos taken of your cabin in March." My coffee cup rattled as I set it down with shaking hands. "They took listing photos of my property? Without my knowledge?" Ashley nodded miserably. "Marcus showed them to me, bragging about how much money the sale would bring in. I thought it was weird that you weren't in any of the photos if it was a family decision, but he said you were busy with work." The betrayal felt complete now. Not only had my family been planning to sell my inheritance for months, but they had been so confident in their ability to manipulate me that they had already begun marketing the property. The casual assumption that I would eventually capitulate, combined with their willingness to break into my home when I didn't, painted a picture of people who saw me not as a family member deserving of respect, but as an obstacle to be managed or overcome. "I'm leaving him," Ashley said quietly. "I can't be with someone who would do this to his own sister, who would lie to me about something this serious. But Sarah, I think you should know. He's not giving up. Even now, he's talking about other ways to convince you, other pressure he can bring to bear. As I drove home from that meeting, I realized that pressing charges for the break-in had been just the beginning. My family's desperation was deeper than I had understood, their deception more extensive, and their willingness to violate my boundaries apparently limitless. Whatever came next, I needed to be prepared for the possibility that the people who had raised me were capable of even more betrayal than I had already discovered. The cabin that Aunt Rebecca had left me was more than just property now. It had become the symbol of my right to exist as an independent person with valid feelings and legitimate boundaries. Protecting it meant protecting myself, and I was beginning to understand that this battle was far from over. Armed with the devastating revelations from Patricia Hernandez and Ashley, I knew I needed to take proactive steps to protect myself. The naive hope that my family would eventually respect my boundaries had been shattered by the evidence of their months-long deception. If they were willing to commit fraud and break into my home, there was no limit to what they might try next. My first stop was the office of Rebecca Chen, an attorney specializing in family law and estate protection whom Emma had recommended. Rebecca was a sharp woman in her 40s who listened to my story with professional detachment, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. "Your instinct to press charges was absolutely correct," she said after I finished explaining the situation. "Without consequences, this behavior would have escalated further. But Sarah, based on what you've told me, I think you need to consider more comprehensive protection." She outlined several steps I should take immediately. First, a restraining order against all 3 family members to legally enforce their distance from both my cabin and my Portland apartment. Second, a detailed documentation of all their threats and manipulation attempts. Third, consultation with a financial advisor to ensure my assets were properly protected from any future legal claims. "There's something else to consider," Rebecca added, her expression serious. "Given their financial desperation and apparent willingness to commit crimes, you should be prepared for the possibility that they might try to forge documents or make false claims about previous agreements regarding the property." This thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. If my father was already telling people I had agreed to sell the cabin, what would stop him from creating fake documents to support that claim? "I want to take out a restraining order," I said firmly. "All of them. And I want to explore what other legal protections are available." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I took Rebecca's advice and began documenting everything. I printed out all the text messages and emails from my family, created a timeline of events, and even drove back to the cabin to take photos showing the basement window they had attempted to break through. During this process, I also made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to sell some of my other investments and pay off my mortgage early, then transfer the cabin's title into a trust that would make it much more difficult for anyone to make claims against the property. Aunt Rebecca had left it to me, but I was going to make sure it stayed mine no matter what legal manipulations my family might attempt. On Wednesday, I received an unexpected call from my cousin David, Uncle Paul's son, who lived in Sacramento. Unlike the hostile calls from other family members, his voice was concerned but respectful. "Sarah, I've been hearing bits and pieces of what's happening, and I wanted to reach out directly," he said. "I know there are multiple sides to every story, but some of the things I'm hearing don't add up." I found myself explaining the entire situation to David, including the recent revelations about the fraud and the months of secret planning. He listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Jesus Christ," he finally said. "Sarah, I had no idea it was this bad. Dad called me ranting about you having Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda arrested, but he made it sound like it was over a simple family disagreement about money. It's never been about money, David. It's been about respect, boundaries, and the right to make decisions about my own property. I get that now. And honestly, Knowing Marcus and his history of dragging everyone into his messes, this all makes sense. Look, I can't speak for the rest of the family, but you have my support. What they did was wrong. Full stop. David's call was like a lifeline. For weeks, I had been receiving nothing but criticism and guilt from family members. Having one person acknowledge that my position was reasonable and my actions justified meant more than I could express. The restraining order hearing went smoothly. Judge Wilson reviewed the evidence of the break-in attempt, the threatening messages, and the pattern of harassment. My family's attorney tried to argue that this was a civil dispute that should be resolved through mediation, but the judge was unimpressed. Attempting to break into someone's home is a criminal matter, not a civil dispute, she stated firmly. The restraining order is granted for all three respondents. They are to stay at least 500 feet away from both Ms. Mitchell's Portland residence and her cabin property, and they are prohibited from any direct or indirect contact. As I left the courthouse, I felt like I could breathe freely for the first time in weeks. The legal protection was in place, my assets were secure, and I finally had some control over the situation. That sense of security was tested sooner than expected. On Friday afternoon, I received a call from Jim Morrison, the locksmith who had changed my cabin locks. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "I just got a call from someone claiming to be your father, asking me to come out and change the locks back, because there had been a family misunderstanding that was now resolved." When I told him I'd need authorization from you directly, he got pretty aggressive. My blood ran cold. Even with a restraining order in place, they were still trying to find ways to access my property. "Jim, please don't change anything without written authorization directly from me. And if anyone else calls claiming to represent me, can you let me know immediately?" "Absolutely. I've been doing this long enough to recognize when something doesn't smell right. This whole situation has red flags all over it." That evening, I drove out to the cabin with a mixture of anxiety and determination. I needed to see the property, to reassure myself that it was still secure and untouched. As I turned onto Mirror Lake Road, I immediately noticed something wrong. There was a car parked at the end of the road with a clear view of my driveway. Not close enough to violate the restraining order, but positioned to watch my property. I called 911 from my car, explaining about the restraining order and the suspicious vehicle. Within 20 minutes, a sheriff's deputy had arrived and was questioning the occupants of the car. From a distance, I watched as my father was apparently given a citation for violating the restraining order and told to leave the area immediately. The deputy came to speak with me afterward. "Your father claims he was just driving through the area and stopped to make a phone call. But given the restraining order and the location where he chose to stop, we cited him for violation of the protection order. If this happens again, he could face arrest." That night, alone in my cabin, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was sadness at the complete breakdown of my family relationships, anger at their continued attempts to violate my boundaries, even after legal intervention, but also a growing sense of strength and self-respect that I had never experienced before. I called Emma to update her on the latest developments. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "A year ago, you would have felt guilty about having your dad ticketed. Now you're protecting yourself without apologizing for it." She was right. The old Sarah would have felt terrible about the restraining order, about involving law enforcement, about taking such a hard line with family. But this new version of myself understood that protecting what mattered most sometimes required measures that felt harsh, but were actually just appropriate boundaries being enforced. On Sunday, I received a call from Ashley with news that was both troubling and oddly reassuring. "Sarah, I thought you should know. Marcus got arrested again yesterday. Something about violating the terms of his bail by trying to access business accounts that were supposed to be frozen." The downward spiral was continuing, and it had nothing to do with my refusal to sell the cabin. Marcus's legal troubles were deepening because of his own continued poor decisions, not because I had failed to sacrifice my inheritance to save him. "There's something else," Ashley continued. "I overheard him on the phone with your parents talking about Plan B. I don't know what that means, but they're definitely not giving up on getting money from your property somehow." After that call, I sat on my dock watching the sunset reflect off Mirror Lake, thinking about how much had changed since this ordeal began. I was no longer the accommodating daughter who put everyone else's needs before her own. I was no longer willing to sacrifice my happiness to maintain family peace at any cost. I had learned to stand up for myself, to set and enforce boundaries, and to protect what mattered most to me. But Ashley's warning about Plan B reminded me that this battle wasn't over yet. My family's desperation was deep, their financial troubles were real, and their willingness to violate boundaries and break laws had been clearly demonstrated. Whatever they were planning next, I would be ready for it. As I prepared to lock up the cabin and drive back to Portland, I made a silent promise to Aunt Rebecca and to myself. No matter what schemes my family devised, no matter what guilt or manipulation they employed, this sanctuary would remain mine. I had found my voice, discovered my strength, and learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable the destructive behavior of people you care about. The cabin represented more than just property now. It was proof that I could stand up for myself and win, that I deserved respect and autonomy, and that my needs and feelings mattered just as much as anyone else's. Whatever came next, I would face it from this position of strength rather than from the weakness of endless accommodation. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the restraining order had been issued. I was barely awake when my phone rang, showing a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Sarah Mitchell?" The voice was professional, authoritative. "This is Detective Barnes with the Oregon State Police Financial Crimes Unit. We need to speak with you about some documents that have come to our attention regarding property fraud." My blood turned to ice. "What kind of documents?" "Ma'am, I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can you come to our office this morning? There are some papers with your signature on them that we need to verify, and some serious allegations that require immediate attention." 2 hours later, I sat in Detective Barnes' sterile office, staring at documents that made my hands shake with rage. Someone had forged my signature on papers, indicating that I had agreed to use the cabin as collateral for Marcus's business debts. The signatures were good. Clearly someone had practiced copying my handwriting, but they weren't mine. These documents were submitted to several of the defrauded investors as proof that the family had secured additional assets to cover the outstanding debts. Detective Barnes explained. "They're dated 6 months ago, which would be long before any of the recent family conflicts came to light." I examined the papers more closely. They purported to be loan agreements where I had pledged the cabin as security for Marcus's business ventures. The forgery was sophisticated, but there were tells, slight differences in how I formed certain letters, and the paper itself felt different from the letterhead I actually used for business correspondence. "I did not sign these documents," I said firmly. "I never agreed to use my property as collateral for anyone's debts, and I certainly didn't do so 6 months ago. I can provide handwriting samples for comparison, and I have documentation showing that I only learned about Marcus's business troubles 6 weeks ago." Detective Barnes nodded, making notes. "We suspected as much. The timeline doesn't match other evidence we've gathered, and frankly, the forgery is good but not perfect. The question is, who created these documents?" I thought about the months of secret planning, the listing photos taken without my knowledge, my father's confidence that I would eventually agree to sell. I believe it was my father, Robert Mitchell. He's been involved in this financial fraud from the beginning, and he has samples of my handwriting from birthday cards and family correspondence over the years. "We'll need you to file a formal complaint for forgery and fraud," Detective Barnes said. "This is separate from the breaking and entering charges. This is felony document fraud with the intent to defraud creditors." As I drove home from the police station, my phone rang constantly. Word had apparently spread through the family network, that law enforcement was investigating the forged documents. Uncle Paul called to yell at me about destroying the family over money. Aunt Carol left a voicemail accusing me of vindictiveness beyond all reason. Even some family friends began calling, having heard various versions of the story and wanting to understand why I was persecuting my parents. But the most disturbing call came from Marcus himself, clearly violating the restraining order. "Sarah, you have to stop this." His voice was panicked, desperate. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Dad could go to prison for years over those documents. Mom might be charged as an accessory. Is your precious cabin really worth destroying our entire family?" I hung up and immediately called Detective Barnes to report the restraining order violation. Within an hour, Marcus was back in custody, his bail revoked for violating the conditions of his release. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor at my Portland apartment. Through the peephole, I saw my mother standing in the hallway, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "Mom, you're violating the restraining order by being here." "Please, Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I just talk to you for 5 minutes? I'm not here to argue or pressure you. I need you to understand what's happening." Something in her demeanor was different from the manipulation and guilt-tripping I had grown accustomed to. She seemed genuinely broken, defeated in a way I had never seen. 5 minutes, I said, stepping aside to let her in. "But I'm recording this conversation for my own protection." Mom sat heavily on my couch, suddenly looking every one of her 62 years. "Your father is being arrested tomorrow morning. The forgery charges, combined with his involvement in Marcus's investor fraud, means he's looking at potential federal charges. The FBI is involved now because some of the investors were from out of state." I felt a complex mix of emotions, sadness for my mother, but also vindication that the serious legal consequences were finally matching the severity of what my family had done. "I didn't know about the forged documents, Sarah. I swear to you, I didn't know Robert had created fake papers with your signature. I knew we were in trouble. I knew Marcus had dragged us into his mess. But I thought the worst that would happen was we'd lose our house to pay back the investors." She was crying now, quietly but steadily. "I'm not here to ask you to drop the charges. I know we've gone too far for that. I'm here to apologize and to tell you that I finally understand what Rebecca saw in you, why she left that cabin to you specifically. This was not the conversation I had expected." "What do you mean?" "All these months, I kept thinking about how selfish you were being, how unreasonable. But watching your father forge those documents, seeing how desperate Marcus has become, realizing how we've all been lying to ourselves and each other, I finally see that you were the only one in this family with any integrity left." Her words hit me harder than any of the guilt trips or manipulation had. This felt like genuine remorse, real recognition of what had happened. "Rebecca used to say that family love without respect isn't really love at all," Mom continued. "She said that if you truly love someone, you honor their autonomy and their right to make their own decisions." I never understood what she meant until now. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of months of conflict and betrayal hanging between us. "Sarah, I can't undo what we've done. I can't take back the pressure, the break-in attempt, the forged documents, any of it. But I want you to know that you were right to stand your ground. You were right to protect what Rebecca left for you. You were right to refuse to be dragged down into our mess." "Mom," I started, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish. I'm leaving your father. The lawyers say I might avoid criminal charges if I cooperate fully with the investigation and demonstrate that I wasn't a willing participant in the most serious crimes. I'm going to move in with my sister Janet in Phoenix while this all gets sorted out." This news was as shocking as everything else that had happened. My parents had been married for 35 years. The idea of them separating, especially under these circumstances, felt surreal. "I don't expect you to forgive me immediately, or maybe ever," she said, standing up to leave. "But I want you to know that I'm proud of the woman you've become. You're stronger than any of us gave you credit for, including me. Rebecca would be proud too." After she left, I sat in my apartment feeling emotionally drained but also strangely at peace. For the first time in this entire ordeal, someone from my family had acknowledged my perspective without trying to manipulate or guilt me. It didn't undo the damage, but it felt like a first step towards some kind of healing. The next morning's news confirmed what Mom had told me. Dad was arrested at their house and charged with multiple federal crimes, including investor fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The local news covered the story, describing it as a family business scheme that had defrauded investors of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I called in sick to work and drove out to the cabin, needing the peace and clarity that only Mirror Lake could provide. As I sat on the dock, watching the morning mist rise from the water, I reflected on everything that had happened. The family I had known was effectively gone. Dad would likely spend years in prison. Marcus faced similar charges and had already violated his bail conditions multiple times. Mom was leaving Oregon to start over somewhere else. The Sunday dinners, the holiday gatherings, the shared family history, all of it had been shattered by their desperation and my refusal to be victimized by it. But something new was emerging from the wreckage. For the first time in my life, I had stood up for myself and won. I had protected what mattered most to me, even when it meant facing down the people who had raised me. I had learned that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, that my needs and boundaries were valid and worth defending. The cabin remained mine, legally and morally. The peace I found here, the creative inspiration, the connection to Aunt Rebecca's memory. All of it was protected now by more than just locks and restraining orders. It was protected by my newfound understanding that I deserved respect, that my autonomy mattered, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. As I prepared to leave the cabin that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not for reconciliation with my family. That seemed impossible now. But for the future I was building for myself. A future based on self-respect, clear boundaries, and the hard-won knowledge that I could face any challenge and emerge stronger on the other side. 1 year later, I stood on the dock at Mirror Lake, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The peace I felt was deeper than anything I had experienced before. Not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of genuine self-respect and hard-won wisdom. The legal battles were over. The family drama had finally settled into a new reality, and I had emerged from it all as a fundamentally different person. The criminal trials had concluded 6 months ago. Dad received a 5-year federal sentence for investor fraud and forgery, though his lawyer had negotiated a plea deal that might see him released in 3 years with good behavior. Marcus got 4 years, but his inability to accept responsibility and his continued attempts to manipulate the system from jail suggested he would serve the full sentence. Mom had indeed cooperated with prosecutors and received probation plus community service, now living quietly with Aunt Janet in Phoenix. The investors had recovered about 60% of their money through asset seizures and the sale of my parents' house. Patricia Hernandez had called to update me on the final settlements and to thank me again for my cooperation with the investigation. "Your refusal to let them use your property as collateral actually saved the other investors from even greater losses," she had explained. "If you had given in to their pressure, they would have leveraged your cabin for additional fraudulent loans. Your strength protected not just yourself, but innocent people you never even met." That perspective had helped me process any lingering guilt about the consequences my family faced. Their legal troubles weren't caused by my refusal to sacrifice my inheritance. They were caused by their own criminal choices over many months. This morning's sunrise was special. Because today marked exactly 1 year since I had walked out of that disastrous family dinner, the night everything changed. I was here to celebrate not just survival but transformation. The cabin itself had become more beautiful than ever. With the legal threats eliminated and my finances secure, I had been able to make improvements that honored both Aunt Rebecca's original vision and my own artistic sensibilities. The guest house now served as my art studio, where I had discovered a passion for watercolor painting that rivaled my love of graphic design. Several of my lake and mountain landscapes had even sold at local galleries, providing both income and deep satisfaction. I had also made peace with solitude in ways I never expected. The enforced distance from my dysfunctional family had initially felt like loss, but it had evolved into freedom. For the first time in my life, I could make decisions based purely on what was best for me, without weighing the impact on people who had never shown the same consideration for my well-being. My relationship with extended family had settled into a new normal. Cousin David visited occasionally, and we had developed a genuine friendship built on mutual respect rather than obligatory family connection. A few other relatives had reached out over the months, curious about my side of the story, and sometimes offering support. Others remained loyal to my parents' version of events, but their disapproval no longer carried the weight it once had. The most surprising development had been my evolving relationship with my mother. After her initial apology, we had begun exchanging cautious emails. She was seeing a therapist in Phoenix, working through decades of enabling behavior and codependency. Our correspondence was limited and careful, but it was honest in a way our relationship had never been before. Her latest email had arrived just yesterday. "Sarah, I've been thinking about the anniversary of everything that happened. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, and I'm not asking for that now. But I want you to know that watching you stand up for yourself, even against impossible pressure, taught me something I should have learned decades ago. You showed me what real strength looks like, and what love without respect actually costs. I hope you're happy and at peace. You deserve both. Love, Mom." I had cried reading those words, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of grief for what our relationship had never been, and gratitude for what it might still become. The professional counseling I had started 6 months ago had helped me understand the family dynamics that had shaped me. Dr. Williams had explained how growing up as the responsible one in a family that centered around crisis and drama had conditioned me to believe my value came from sacrificing for others. Learning to prioritize my own needs hadn't been selfish. It had been essential psychological growth. "You broke a generational pattern," she had told me during one of our sessions. "Your great Aunt Rebecca tried to teach you these lessons, but you had to live through the crisis to truly understand them. The strength you showed will echo forward in ways you may never fully realize." That strength had indeed echoed into other areas of my life. My freelance design business had grown significantly, partly because my new confidence translated into better client relationships and more assertive pricing. I had even hired an assistant and was considering expanding into larger commercial projects. But the most meaningful change was internal. I no longer feared conflict or disapproval in the way I once had. I could say no without elaborate justifications. I could prioritize my needs without guilt. I could recognize manipulation and respond to it with calm boundaries rather than anxious accommodation. As I sat on the dock this anniversary morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Thinking of you today. So proud of how far you've come. You've inspired me to set better boundaries with my own family. Brunch next weekend to celebrate your survivorversary?" I smiled, typing back, "Absolutely. And thank you for standing by me through all of this. Your friendship means everything." Emma had indeed been inspired by my journey to examine her own family relationships. Watching her grow more confident and self-respecting over the past year had shown me that standing up for yourself doesn't just protect you, It gives others permission to protect themselves too. A movement at the edge of the lake caught my attention. A doe and her fawn were drinking at the water's edge, completely unbothered by my presence. Aunt Rebecca had always said that Mirror Lake was a place where wild things felt safe, where they could be themselves without fear. I finally understood what she meant. Later that morning, I walked through the rooms of the cabin, touching surfaces and remembering not just Aunt Rebecca's presence, but all the ways I had made this place truly mine. The kitchen, where I had learned to make her apple cinnamon scones from her handwritten recipe cards. The living room, where I had spent countless evenings reading by the fireplace, finally able to relax without worrying about family crises. The bedroom, where I had slept peacefully, knowing that this sanctuary was protected by law and by my own hard-won strength. In the afternoon, I drove into the nearby town of Cascade Falls to run errands. At the coffee shop where I had become a regular, the barista Kelly greeted me with a warm smile. "The usual, Sarah? And how's the painting coming along?" This was what healthy relationships looked like, I realized. Mutual interest, respectful boundaries, genuine care without obligation or manipulation. The friendships I had built in this small mountain community were based on who I was now, not on family obligations or childhood patterns. As evening approached, I prepared for a small celebration I had planned. David was driving up from Sacramento with his wife Maria, whom I had grown to love. My friend Emma was coming from Portland. Even Drive, Williams had accepted my invitation to join us for dinner, saying she rarely saw such a complete transformation in a client and wanted to celebrate the milestone. We gathered on the deck overlooking the lake as the sun set, sharing a meal I had prepared using vegetables from the garden I had expanded this year. The conversation was easy, filled with laughter and genuine connection. No one was walking on eggshells. No one was managing anyone else's emotions. No one was keeping score of who had sacrificed what for whom. "I want to make a toast," David said, raising his glass of wine. "To Sarah, who showed us all what courage looks like. You didn't just protect your property, you protected your right to exist as your own person. That took more strength than any of us fully understood at the time." "To new foundations," Emma added, "built on self-respect and genuine love." "To breaking cycles," Dr. Williams contributed, "and to the ripple effects of one person choosing health over habit." As we touched glasses, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because the pain of losing my original family was gone, that would probably always ache in some corner of my heart, but because I had built something better from the wreckage. I had learned that family isn't just about shared blood or history. It's about mutual respect, support without conditions, and love that doesn't require you to diminish yourself to maintain it. That night, after my guests had left and I was alone in the cabin that was truly mine, I sat by the fireplace with Aunt Rebecca's journal, which I had found among her things after the legal battles ended. Her words from 30 years ago seemed written for this moment. "The hardest lesson I ever learned was that you cannot love someone into respecting you. You cannot sacrifice yourself into mattering to people who are determined to see you as less than you are. Real love, the kind worth having, sees you clearly and cherishes what it sees. Everything else is just emotional manipulation dressed up in family obligations." Sarah, my dear girl, when you read this someday, remember that your worth isn't determined by your willingness to be used. It's inherent, unshakable, and worthy of protection. I closed the journal and looked around at the life I had built, peaceful, creative, authentic, and entirely my own. The cost had been higher than I ever imagined it could be. But the alternative, remaining trapped in patterns of manipulation and sacrifice, would have cost me something even more precious: my sense of self. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the ongoing work of living as a person who knows her own worth. But tonight, on this anniversary of my liberation, I felt nothing but gratitude for the strength I had found, the boundaries I had built, and the peace I had created. The cabin that Aunt Rebecca had left me had indeed taught me everything I needed to know about standing up for myself. But more than that, it had become the foundation for a life lived on my own terms, with people who saw my worth and celebrated it rather than exploiting it. As I prepared for bed, I whispered a thank you to my great-aunt, whose wisdom and love had guided me through the darkest period of my life and into the light of authentic self-respect. Her greatest gift hadn't been the property itself. It had been the lesson that some things are worth protecting, even when the cost seems impossibly high. I was finally home, not just in this beautiful place by the lake, but in my own skin, my own life, my own strength. And that was worth more than all the family approval I had once desperately sought, but would never truly need again.